Well, thanks for being here, everybody. This is the 6th stop on our tour, and we have many more stops to make. And it's been really good so far. We've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people and given away thousands and thousands and thousands of cannabis seeds. And next weekend, I'm going to be flying to St. John's, and I'll be in Halifax, and then we'll be making our way back across the country. We got about 20 more stops to do on this second year of our Overgrow Canada tour. Last year we were able to give away about 2.5 million seeds by the end of the whole thing, and this year we've done almost 2 million already. Last year I didn't really expect it to become this massive thing that it was, and we kind of got overwhelmed and it was a bit challenging, but we have gotten things so tight this year. We've gotten over 2 million seeds out. There's people at my house that have been there all weekend working away, and in fact there's probably been 600 or 700 hours of volunteer labor put in to make this campaign a reality. There's dozens of people that have been at my house every weekend packing up seeds, sorting seeds, getting all of our sponsor cards in there and making this a reality. And so although it's easy to come up with these ideas, I'm going to give away millions of seeds, it really takes a lot of other people stepping up and getting involved to make that really happen. So I want to talk tonight about the history of cannabis in Canada and tell you some stories you might not have heard about how important the cannabis plant has been to our country's history, to our economy, and to everything about Canada since the earliest days of our country. And maybe when I finish my talk, you might agree with me that the leaf that should be on our flag is not the maple leaf, it's the cannabis leaf, because that plant has been so important to our country in so many ways. In fact, when the first European colonists came to North America, they were being sent largely to find places they could grow more cannabis hemp for England and France. At this time, in the 1600s and 1700s, cannabis hemp was a primary world economy, big part of the world economy, and it was so important because it kept the navies of the world afloat. They were reliant on those strong hemp fibers to get their ropes and sails that they needed. And it was a very labor-intensive and difficult job to separate the pulpy mass of the inner part of the cannabis fiber with the strong outer fibers. And it took a lot of work and a lot of labor and a lot of space. And so England and France were dependent on Russia to get their hemp fiber. And they were both looking for other places around the world where they could do that. In fact, one of the main reasons that England was sending their prisoners to Australia was not that their prisons were full or something like that. It was because they thought Australia would be a great place to grow more cannabis hemp, and they wanted that prison slave labor to go there and do it for them. It didn't work out the way they'd hoped, but that was why they were sending prisoners to Australia. And that was why for 200 years in Canada, governments did everything they could to encourage these colonists to grow more hemp fiber. Under the French administrators in Quebec in the early days, they were so desperate to grow more hemp, they would bribe the farmers with big subsidies, and they would also punish them in different ways if they didn't grow enough hemp. One of the early administrators, Jean Talon, actually seized all of the thread out of Quebec and wouldn't return it to anybody, so they couldn't make their clothes or make any textiles or anything like that unless they would grow more hemp fiber and bring it to them. Another administrator, several decades later, tried to bring in African slaves to work in the Canadian hemp field so they could have that source of cheap labor, but they weren't able to raise enough funds, and the slaves could go for higher prices in other areas, so that was never accomplished. But they pushed and they pushed to try to grow more hemp in Canada, to grow more cannabis, and it wasn't until the 1800s that it really became a big industry and there was enough labor and enough people in the country to get the cannabis industry growing. In fact, the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic Wars were greatly influenced by cannabis and cannabis availability. England and France were putting blockades against each other and trying to stop trade with each other, and Napoleon made a deal with Russia, signed a treaty that Russia would not trade with England, so that England would not be able to get the hemp fiber they needed. It was the only way he thought he could beat the British Navy, was to deprive them of their hemp, so after a year or two, their sails and their ropes wouldn't be able to be replenished. And Russia went along with this for a while, but eventually they changed their minds. It was too important to their economy to keep selling cannabis to the British. That was why Napoleon ended up invading Russia, and his disastrous winter invasion was because he was trying to punish and stop the Russians from selling valuable hemp to the British for their war effort. And that was why the British were so desperate to try to grow more hemp in Canada. Finally, in the early 1800s, there was enough people here, enough labor, the technology had advanced that cannabis hemp became a major part of the Canadian economy. It was grown in every province, and there was hemp mills in every province. The federal government was bringing in hemp mill technology from the US and from Ireland and subsidizing and building the cannabis industry in Canada. And what's even more interesting about the 1800s and cannabis is how important medical marijuana was becoming. Between 1850 and around 1990, between 1850 and the 1900s, over 100 scientific papers were written on the medical benefits of cannabis and published in Canadian medical journals. There's all kinds of advertisements for cannabis products and discussion about the medical benefits of cannabis for a wide variety of ailments in the late 1800s. And you could see all these different references and discussions. What was interesting at this time is they didn't really know how cannabis medicines worked or what THC or CBD or cannabinoids were at all. And they weren't sure if it was the oil or the resin or what the active ingredients were. And so there was no chemical test for potency. And so people buying cannabis extracts would sometimes get something that was very mild and useless. At other times they might buy something that was too strong and set them on a psychoactive trip. And one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world, Park Davis, regularly advertised in Canadian medical journals that it was true. There was no chemical test for cannabis potency, but you could trust their products for a standardized dose because they used a biological test for potency. And what that biological test meant was that they had a lab with a whole bunch of dogs. And somebody's job would be to give those dogs a big dose of cannabis medicine and then take notes and write down how long it took for the dog's tongue to flop out of its mouth and how long it took for the dog's front legs to buckle and for it to fall over and pass out. And they would use this technology to judge the potency of their cannabis extracts and standardize what they were making. This went on for many decades, and hundreds of dogs were used in Canada and the US to titrate and judge the potency of cannabis. It was a detailed methodology, and they even had to use the same dog multiple times to get a baseline, but if you use the same dog too many times, it starts to get used to it and enjoy it, and so it doesn't really work so well anymore.
That's a lucky dog, yes.
Well, I'm not a big fan of animal testing, but if you got to be one of the animals in the lab, probably the dog that's getting super high every day is one of the better gigs to have. But so cannabis medicines were widespread. There's a great story in the Canadian medical journals in the 1850s about Canada's first hashish overdose. Now we know that a cannabis overdose doesn't mean you die, it just means you feel uncomfortable and you're too high, and that's exactly what happened to this guy. He was somebody who, according to his doctor, they said his only crime was the love he bore for science. But he really, really wanted to get high. He'd heard about the wonders of cannabis indica, the Indian hemp, and he had tried it a few times and it had no effect. Maybe you've met somebody like this who says, "Oh, it doesn't work on me, I tried it, nothing happens." So his doctor said to him, "Well, why don't you try some of this?" and gave him a very potent dose of cannabis extract, which the man took, and an hour or two later, his soul is leaving his body and flying around the room, and he's alternating between moments of ecstasy and bliss and moments of existential dread and terror and having not a very pleasant time. And at the end of it, he says, "I would never attempt such a dread experiment again, and how wrong I was to ever try this deadly or dangerous plant." But what's interesting about it is that the doctor described this as being such a rare occurrence that it was worthy of taking note in a medical journal. So most people, this was not happening, and these kind of circumstances were quite rare. In fact, there's many records of doctors taking enormous doses of cannabis medicines at this time in order to show their patients how safe it was. Some of them recorded effects like the time slow effect, where they would notice that the second hand on their watch seemed to take a really long time to get around that dial, or the wheels on their carriage would seem to be going really slow, even though they were actually traveling at quite a rapid pace. In 1895, the head of the Nova Scotia Medical Association gave a great lecture about the medical and recreational use of cannabis, and they reprinted the entire lecture in the Nova Scotia Medical Journal. It's a great read. It reads like it could have been written just a few months ago. He talks about topical cannabis ointments for medicinal effects and getting rid of corns and helping with topical ailments. He talks about using cannabis extracts and cannabis tinctures for a huge different range of ailments and why they work for so many different things. He talks about a cannabis to enhance sexuality and make you last longer and have better orgasms. And He only talks about that with men because it is still 1895, but it shows that people were using this cannabis plant for medicine, for recreation, for spirituality, for sexuality, all the same reasons that we use it today. And this was very, very widespread at the time. So how did we get from this common use of cannabis to the current prohibition that we have now? Well, that began in the early 1900s in what we call the war on drugs now and the war on cannabis. It began with the war on opium. And the reason there was a war on opium was not based on scientific research or any kind of understanding of the risks or benefits of opium. It was entirely racism and an effort to eliminate Chinese people out of British Columbia and the rest of the country. What had happened was there had been a lot of Chinese men who had been lured to come to Canada to work on our railways and in the gold mines, and they were actually treated quite callously, and many of them died working here. And when those jobs were done, there was a large pool of single men living in Chinatowns across the country, but especially on the West Coast, and they would work for lower wages than white men would work for, which kind of made sense because they wouldn't have families to support, and it wasn't as easy to send money home back then as it might be now. But one thing that was different is that the Chinese community tended to use opium over alcohol. That wasn't actually a bad choice. These had big, back-breaking, laborious jobs, and opium is a powerful pain reliever. And also a common deadly ailment of the time was dysentery, which is basically diarrhea so bad that you dehydrate and die, and this killed a lot of people. Well, aside from being a pain reliever, one of the side effects of opium use is constipation, so it's actually a good folk remedy for dysentery. It can help save your life. And why were the Chinese using opium also? Was because Britain had gone to war with China a few decades earlier and essentially forced them to take Indian opium into their country. And that was because the British had become addicted to a Chinese drug that we call tea. And they were spending so much of their silver to buy Chinese tea that it was bankrupting the British treasury. And so since they controlled India at the time, and there was opium in India, they took that opium, sold it to the Chinese to redress their trade imbalance. China didn't like that, but like prohibitionist efforts always, it totally failed. It empowered the British smugglers to eventually go to war with China and force China to open up their ports and accept British opium. I think if China had been more reasonable and legalized and taxed and regulated opium on their own, they wouldn't have had the opium wars. The history would have been very different. But they chose a prohibitionist route. They were defeated by the British. That's when British took Hong Kong as an opium trading port. So it made sense for the Chinese workers to be using opium in essentially British Canada at this time. But there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment and regular riots and protests against the Chinese. There was groups in Vancouver like the Anti-Chinese League or the Anti-Asiatic League. They weren't subtle in their names, and they would gather often at Hastings in Maine in downtown Vancouver and get all riled up, and they'd go into Chinatown and beat people up and break windows and trash buildings. And there was a really big riot like that in 1907, and the federal government sent a guy by the name of William Lyon Mackenzie King out to investigate and to make reparations to the Chinese community and had their property damaged. Now, William Lyon Mackenzie King at this time was just the Deputy Minister of Labour, but in a few years he would become Prime Minister of Canada. And he was later known for using a Ouija board to talk to his dead dog and dead mother and get political advice from them. And apparently they gave him good advice because he was Prime Minister for a long time, and apparently his dog and his mom did not like opium or cannabis because he oversaw the expansion and the creation of the war on drugs in Canada, and while he was Prime Minister for a couple of decades, he put in all the infrastructure of the modern war on drugs. And so when he was here, he saw that some opium dens were looking for compensation, and he ended up drafting and passing Canada's first anti-opium laws when he became Minister of Labour. And those laws were explicitly designed against the Chinese community, and once they were passed, we saw mass deportations of Chinese, mass imprisonment of Chinese for opium use, whereas whites who were using opium tinctures or other extracts, they weren't punished at all. It was only opium smoking at this time that was the big thing, because that was how Chinese used it. And there was a very real racial panic among white Canadians that we were on the verge of taking over our country, of Chinese and blacks and foreigners taking over our country and dominating the white race through cannabis and through opium. Now, these were fantastical ideas not based in reality, but they were still very real fears that were reflected in the media very often. There was a book called The Black Candle by a woman named Emily Murphy. It was a bestseller. She called herself Janie Canuck when she wrote her books because she was a real patriotic Canadian. And her book was serialized in Maclean's magazine. It was very popular. And in her book, she talked about how the Chinese race was trying to dominate the white race with opium. And she turned things around and said, the Chinese don't even use opium themselves. They just bring it here to hook us white people on it, especially our white woman that they're trying to get and impregnate with their Chinese genes. And this was also brought up by black people as well, that the blacks are coming and trying to dominate us with cannabis. She quoted an American chief of police talking about the violence and degradation caused by cannabis use, and how cannabis users become immune to pain and have no conscience and will kill and rape and murder without consideration. There was newspaper articles at this time in the 1920s and early 30s talking about how Southern American states had been so taken over by marijuana violence and marijuana crime that the police were fleeing and that communities were being destroyed, and like a vine growing out of Mexico and smothering America, it was going to come to Canada and wreak havoc up here as well. I read articles about people, kids in elementary schools who were dying of marijuana overdoses and telling their parents before they died about how all their friends were also hooked on marijuana. And these kind of fantastical, artificial stories were very common in the media at this time, and so there was a fear about cannabis, or about marijuana and hashish anyways, although most Canadians didn't really realize that marijuana and hash was the same as the hemp plant. We saw Canada's first anti-marijuana law passed in 1923, and that law was kind of passed in a very vague way. There wasn't any big discussion. It was just brought up in Parliament. We're adding a new drug to the schedule. All right, that sounds good, and that was it. Marijuana and Indian hemp was handwritten onto one of the documents when it was banned. But nobody was arrested in Canada for using cannabis, and cannabis medicine was still available, and I don't think they even realized what they'd done when they passed it, because the same year they passed that anti-marijuana law, Parliament also passed the Hemp Bounty Act to grow more hemp in Canada, to encourage hemp cultivation in the prairies. And hemp cultivation had actually started to fall out of favor by the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, not because of political reasons, but technological reasons. There had been the invention of the steam engine, which meant that boats didn't need all those sails anymore, or quite as much rope, and so hemp wasn't in such big demand. And there'd also been the invention of the cotton engine, or the cotton gin. That meant that cotton fibers could be processed so much more easily than the backbreaking labor it took to process hemp. And so hemp had fallen out of favor. But in the 1920s, it looked like hemp was about to make a huge comeback, because a new machine had been invented called the decorticator. And this new technology, which was actually perfected in Ontario as well as in the US, this new machine would allow hemp to be processed by just sucking out that inner pulpy core and separating it out in an instant, what used to be a very laborious task. And not only could those fibers then be used for ropes and textiles, but that inner pulpy core that used to be thrown away, that could now also be used for all kinds of purposes. Pretty much anything you make out of plastics, you could make out of that same material. And so the headlines at the time were talking about hemp making a huge comeback. There's a famous article in Popular Mechanics magazine that talks about the new billion-dollar crop. That's $1 billion in 1930s money. We're talking trillions of dollars now. And the reason it was so valuable was that this inner pulpy mass could now be used. What was once a waste product was going to become incredibly useful. That article about the billion-dollar crop came out in 1938, at a time when the cannabis panic and the marijuana panic was also at a peak, and it was the same year that in Canada, William Lyon Mackenzie King, as Prime Minister, finally passed an absolute prohibition on all forms of cannabis, including hemp, and that was really the beginning of the modern prohibition. RCMP went out and burned hemp fields to the ground. Farmers were in the newspaper saying, we had no idea we'd been growing a deadly narcotic crop on our land. We thought it was just a useful source of fibers and seeds. After they went to the farmers, they went to the birdseed manufacturers, and they raided them and forced them to take hemp seeds out of their birdseed products, because hemp seed is the most incredible birdseed that there is, and very popular and very widely used. And then after that, they went to the marijuana dispensaries and the pharmacies that were selling marijuana products, and they raided them. In fact, the first recorded person who was charged and convicted of marijuana possession in Canada was in 1938. It was a man who said he bought some marijuana cigarettes at a pharmacy to treat his hay fever. And the judge said it's a deadly narcotic drug and gave him 6 months hard labor. And the first convicted person we have for trafficking in marijuana was a pharmacist in Canada who was selling pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes at his pharmacy. And he said, I never considered marijuana to be a narcotic. And he was also convicted of trafficking in marijuana. You could actually buy pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes in Canadian pharmacies from 1850 till about 1930. It wasn't the most popular way to use cannabis, but they were definitely available. I've seen the ads, I've read the articles, it's absolutely true. And so the war on cannabis began not with going after drug dealers or protecting youth. It began with burning hemp fields, busting birdseed manufacturers, and arresting medical marijuana patients and pharmacists. And that was the beginning of the war on cannabis. And cannabis use went underground, and it became less popular or less hidden. There wasn't a lot of arrests at this time, but they started to pick up, and there was a few dozen every year. And in fact, Canada then re-legalized cultivation of hemp for 2 years during World War II for the war effort. We needed that hemp fiber, and a source of other fibers were being cut off during the war, and so for 2 years in Canada, 1943 and 44, they started growing hemp in Canada again. The U.S. did this as well, and they actually made a movie in the U.S. called Hemp for Victory, which was about a 15-minute film that encouraged their hemp farmers to get out there and grow more hemp, and what a great plant hemp was and how important it was to the war effort. Even the Nazis recognized the medicinal or the industrial benefits of hemp fiber. The Nazis put out a little book called the Humorous Hemp Primer. And the Humorous Hemp Primer had illustrations with the two little rosy-cheeked Aryan cannabis plants, a male and a female, and funny rhyming couplets on how to grow more hemp for the fatherland. But after World War II, hemp cultivation ended around the world. America actually told England and some other countries it would only enter the war. One of the agreements was if England would ensure to promote prohibition in many of its colonies around the world. And at the end of World War II, cannabis had actually been a big part of Japanese culture for centuries. But at the end of World War II, when they rewrote the Japanese Constitution, they included cannabis prohibition in there as well. And so it was a dark time for cannabis in Canada and around the world during the 1940s and early 50s. But one thing that did happen was a lot of young Canadian men had gone overseas to France and Africa during the war. They'd been exposed to hashish in Europe, and when they came back to Canada, they brought knowledge of this plant and the cannabis experience with them when they went to colleges and universities around the country. And so the cannabis culture began to grow again, and we saw the beat generation beginning in the 1950s, which evolved into the yippies and then the hippies in the 1960s. And cannabis use began to increase quite a bit. When it was increasing in the 50s, the federal government decided we needed a commission on cannabis. And so this was a few decades before the Larsen Commission. Canada's Senate got together and had hearings on cannabis use, but they mostly talked to police, and Harry Anslinger came up and gave some comments. He's the famous head of the American drug war for many decades, and this commission recommended even more severe penalties. And they made it after that, in 1960 or so, it was passed, and it was a 6-month mandatory minimum for simple possession of cannabis. And yet at the same time, they put in these incredibly strict laws, 6 months mandatory minimum for possession of cannabis. At the same time that was in place, we saw the biggest flowering of the cannabis culture in Canadian history, where cannabis use accelerated and grew through the 1960s and early 1970s, where there used to be a few dozen arrests a year, then there was a few hundred, then a few thousand, then tens of thousands of arrests every year. And by the early 70s, it was getting out of control. And no longer was it just marginalized people or racial minorities that were being charged. Now it was mainstream white young Canadians being charged. And so the federal government decided to launch a commission under Pierre Trudeau. They launched the Larsen Commission. And the Larsen Commission was an incredibly comprehensive look at cannabis and cannabis users and the health and social and cultural effects of cannabis. And after comprehensive study, the Larsen Commission recommended total decriminalization of possession and personal cultivation, and that there be a little more research before we finally legalize cannabis entirely to figure out how to make that happen. And we've heard that cry, that was 1971, the year I was born. We've heard that cry for more research every year, every decade since then. But actually, what's fascinating when I discovered this was at the same time as they launched the Larsen Commission, they also hired a scientist named Ralph Miller, who lives out here on Vancouver Island, to do some comprehensive research into cannabis in a way that had never been done before. He had a bunch of researchers and a lot of funding, and they did cultural and social analysis. They talked to dealers and growers and smugglers and police. They analyzed trafficking networks, they did driving studies, they did IQ studies, they did some really strange and wonderful studies. One that they did was they hired a bunch of young women and they said, we're going to study the effects of cannabis on motivation. So we're going to hire you to come stay at this hospital for a month, and your job is to knit colorful scarves. Every scarf you knit, we're going to pay you some decent money. But we're also going to make you smoke increasingly potent marijuana joints every day that you're there, and we're going to see if that makes you get more or less motivated to knit these scarves. And so these women were there for a month, knitting their hearts out every day. They had to smoke, they said, joints the size of your pinky finger. There'd be a nurse there saying, you didn't finish that joint, you've got to get right down to the roach there before you're allowed to start knitting. So there was all this research being done, all this fascinating and strange and wonderful research. And then at the end of all that research that Ralph Miller did, before any of the results could be analyzed, the federal government cut off all their funding, and not a single piece of information was put together or released in any way. They never analyzed any of the results. In fact, Ralph Miller, when I talked to him, he said he still thinks that stuff's on microfiche somewhere in Ottawa, and that it would be great to get our hands on that and finish that research now. But what hypocrisy to say that there's not enough research been done when 46 years ago, they were doing all this research, they had it all done, and they refused to analyze it. So we're in the 1970s, cannabis use is increasing, the Ledane Commission says it's time to decriminalize. Everyone thinks it should be legal. In the U.S., Jimmy Carter was saying that possession should be decriminalized. Many American states are having referendums and passing decriminalization laws. And then people think it's going to be legal. Normal Canada even has a victory party for legalization. And yet, by 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected in the U.S. Nancy Reagan restarts the war on drugs. Canada, we lose Trudeau, we get Brian Mulroney as our Prime Minister instead, and Mulroney relaunches the war on drugs in a bigger way than ever before. He even passes Canada's strict censorship laws, Section 462.2 of the Criminal Code, that bans all literature and instruments for illicit drug use. All paraphernalia, pipes and bongs pretty much disappeared in Canada over the next 2 years. High Times magazines, books about growing marijuana, Cheech and Chong movies, all these things were banned in Canada as literature for illicit drug use and were virtually unavailable across the country. This lasted for about 10 years or so, from the late 80s until the mid-90s, when cannabis products were simply not available. The police shut down hundreds of head shops on Yonge Street alone, and thousands of head shops across the country. And then in the mid-1990s, we saw the beginning of what I see as the modern marijuana movement, which has evolved into Canada's largest civil disobedience movement ever by a huge factor. And it began with bongs and pipes in Vancouver, and Mark Emery and others opening up stores and selling paraphernalia in their communities. And at this time, and these laws are still on the books now, but in the 90s it reminded me of what's happening now with dispensaries, where they'd be opening up bong shops all over the place, and some communities would accept them, others would have raids, people would go to jail, sometimes for for a week or two over their bong shops. So I witnessed many of these raids. Cops would come in, take all these glass pipes, put them in cardboard boxes, throw them into the back of a police truck, you hear them all smashing. Just like dispensaries now, they often wouldn't bother laying charges. It was just the process of taking all your stuff and the raid and all the bail conditions and things that were really the challenge. And some shops opened and shut down, couldn't handle it. Others opened and reopened and fought off the police. And for about a 2-year period there in the mid-90s, there was over 24 shops opened, which are all still open across Canada. And in many cases are the heart of activism in their communities. And so that was the beginning. And with bong shops, we saw seed banks opening, and we saw cannabis rallies getting bigger and bigger. We saw vapor lounges opening across Canada, and that evolved. And now we've seen, 20 years ago, we saw the first medical marijuana dispensaries opening tentatively in a few cities across the country. And in Vancouver, they had no problems. In Victoria, Ted Smith fought off the police and went to court over and over again to keep his place open. And the dispensary movement has grown and evolved, and now there's plenty of dispensaries, mine included, that don't require medical necessity to sell cannabis. And we're really evolving a system in Canada now that's much like what they have in Holland with coffee shops, because in Holland, there's all the laws against cannabis are still in place at the federal level. If you get caught bringing hash or cannabis or anything to a coffee shop to sell to them, if you get caught on the way, they will charge you with trafficking and arrest you and take all your stuff. And penalties won't be as severe as they might be in the U.S., but you'll still be punished and maybe go to jail. But once you get that cannabis in the back shop, in the back door of the coffee shop, then it's legal. They call it the back door, front door policy. Once you're in the back door, you're safe, and then they can sell it out the front door, and it's not a problem. And it's all done at the municipal level with municipal licensing, and the federal government just kind of accepts it and goes along with it, and they create this kind of de facto system. That's what's happening in Vancouver, and it's happening here as well, in other cities, and there's going to be a lot of challenges ahead, but dispensaries are winning this battle. Just like bong shops won. Bong shops still get raided once or twice every year or two in Canada, some small town, or Winnipeg especially has a vendetta against their bong shops. Every 18 months or so they raid them all, but by and large, most Canadians don't even realize that bongs are illegal because we've defeated that law. That law is now a zombie law that's rarely enforced and people don't even know it exists. And we're getting that way with dispensaries as well. We're moving towards a future where cannabis will be normalized and open and unenforceable in most of the country, regardless of what the federal government and what Trudeau does. So that's why I've been traveling around giving out seeds and promoting this Overgrow Canada campaign, because I see this as the final phase in this movement of civil disobedience that we started in the 90s with bong shops. Now we have dispensaries. But growing cannabis openly is still something you can't really do without a license anywhere in Canada yet. I can sell cannabis in many cities to people, but we can't grow it yet. And I want to live in a country where cannabis is like any other plant. And that if you walk down the street and you see someone's got a patch of plants in their front yard, it's just not a big deal because you've seen a dozen of those already that day walking around your neighborhood. And I think that's the kind of country that I want to live in, where cannabis is like any other plant. We walk around now, there's dozens of plants around you that would kill you or make you hallucinate if you were to eat them or smoke them, and you could potentially do yourself a lot of damage. And cannabis is much safer than those plants and should be able to grow freely and openly all across the country. And so, in many ways it feels now like when I read about the 70s with American states passing decriminalization or legalization, and we've got a Trudeau in Parliament who says he's going to legalize, although he's taking his time about it certainly. And I don't think that waiting for our politicians to act is what got us here right now. It's been pushing against them. It's breaking these laws openly and building a critical mass of Canadians willing to stand up and openly defy these laws and make them unenforceable. Because they can pick us off one by one if we try to hide. But if we all stand up together, it becomes impossible to enforce, and they back down, as they have over and over again over the last 20 years. So, I want you to think of a better future and of what we're trying to work together for here and what legalization really means. So I want you to imagine yourself as a grandparent or a great-grandparent in the future, and you're at home with your grandchild. They're getting ready for school in the morning and reading their book and cramming for an exam. You've just had some cannabis medicine. You're enjoying your hemp-based cereal. And your grandchild turns to you and they say, "Hey, Grandma, Granddad, I'm reading in my history book here, and I want to ask you something. I'm reading this chapter on cannabis. And it says here that cannabis was illegal in Canada for like 100 years, and that people would be arrested for it and charged, and the jails had a lot of cannabis users, and it was a big deal that went on for all this time. And that just seems really strange to me. It seems strange to me because I know that the history book that I'm reading is printed on cannabis hemp paper. I know that we had hemp porridge for breakfast, and I love the way hemp seeds taste on my salads and in my foods. And I know that you use cannabis medicines to treat the aches and pains of being a senior citizen. I know that we have a cannabis patch in the backyard, and I love helping you tend those plants, and they're so beautiful in the summer when they grow. And I know that the bus that takes me to school runs on hemp biodiesel fuel and is made out of hemp composite plastics. And I know that my school itself is built out of cannabis fiberboard and uses hemp for insulation. And I know that the clothes I'm wearing right now are made out of cannabis hemp. And so how can it be that this plant was illegal for so long? How can it be that this makes no sense to me? And I want you to be able to say, yeah, it's true. It was a dark time. And if we used cannabis for medicine, and just because we enjoyed it, we had to hide, we had to be afraid something bad was going to happen to us. Sometimes we couldn't tell our own family members that we were cannabis users because they would judge us or want to punish us. And maybe myself or someone else in our family was arrested and charged and maybe jailed for growing or sharing cannabis with other people, and it was a really dark time. But I also want you to be able to say, you know what though? I did something to change those laws. I sacrificed, I gave something. I wrote letters to the editor every day. I talked to people who didn't understand about cannabis. I opened a dispensary or a head shop or a vapor lounge, or I made sure I voted, or I did something. I gave something to help end those cannabis laws and end prohibition. And what a great day it was when those laws finally truly ended and the cannabis prisoners got to leave the prisons, and we knew we never had to worry about being punished by these laws again. And we did that so that you, that future generation, would never have to fear arrest or punishment for what herbal medicine you use, or to be arrested or charged for what plants you grow in your garden. That is the legacy that I want to leave to my children and grandchildren. I don't want to pass this prohibition, this drug war down to them the way it's been passed down to all of us. So that's why I'm out here giving away seeds, and I hope that you will join me in my dream of overgrowing Canada, of overgrowing the world with this wonderful cannabis plant. It's really the world's best plant in terms of its medicinal, nutritional, industrial, social, spiritual uses. Hope you will join me in this campaign. Hope you'll grab some seeds and plant them around town in public places, in front of City Hall or the police station or traffic circles or other spots like that. Absolutely. And I hope that when you plant those seeds together we will plant the seeds of cannabis, and we will reap a harvest of freedom. There you go. Thank you very much. I hope that's a lovely looking plant. That's good. Did you grow that?